Helena had spent years moving through life as if she were made of quiet air, present, necessary, but almost always unnoticed. Her cafeteria sat on a corner close to the sea, where the morning breeze carried the scent of salt and roasted beans. She arrived before the sun, unlocking the door with the same stillness she carried in her chest. The space reflected her essence: warm light, wooden shelves, a few plants struggling to thrive, and a counter polished so many times that her reflection felt like a younger version she no longer recognized. She moved carefully between tables, arranging chairs with the precision of someone who had learned to live sem excesos, sem ruidos, sem dores expostas. Her life had settled into this rhythm long before she realized it. Years of marriage had faded into something functional, then fragile, and eventually into separation that left behind an invisible weight. Her son had grown, built a life fora de casa, and Helena found herself adjusting to a quieter world. She rarely complained, even when exhaustion pressed against her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. She breathed through it with maturity, resilience, and a softness that life had tried to steal from her more than once. Every morning, regular customers filled the room with conversations that drifted like distant birdsong. Helena greeted each person with a measured smile, never intrusive, always cordial. Yet she sensed how easily people overlooked her. They saw the pastries, the coffee, the atmosphere, but rarely the woman who created it. Sometimes she wondered when exactly she had begun fading into the background. Perhaps it had happened slowly, when she chose stability over confrontation, silence over conflict, and routine over desire. Her hands carried quiet tremors from years of hard work. The faint lines on her face were not marks of age, but remnants of unspoken worries. She arranged fresh pastries on the display and brushed crumbs from the counter absent-mindedly, letting the ocean wind push through the open door and lift a few strands of her graying hair. Maturity suited her, though she rarely believed it. She moved with the graceful fatigue of someone who had lost a version of herself along the way. Outside, the world awakened with soft shadows and shifting light. Helena watched the seagulls glide across the sky and felt a familiar ache, one that whispered about paths she never took, loves she never allowed, and dreams guardados numa gaveta esquecida. She built her days around service, serving coffee, serving calm, serving constancy. People relied on her without realizing it, yet beneath her composed exterior lived a subtle longing to be seen again, not as a caretaker, not as a worker, not as a mother fulfilling expectations, but as a woman with depth, grace, and an inner world shaped by survival. She often remembered how she used to laugh louder, move quicker, dream bigger, but life had a way of sanding down edges until only quiet resilience remained. Her solitude did not feel heavy, yet it carried an emptiness she pretended not to notice. She filled it with aromas of cinnamon, with the glow of afternoon light on polished cups, with the soft hum of the coffee machine. These small rituals held her together, offering structure when emotions threatened to spill into places she preferred to keep untouched. As the day passed, Helena wiped tables, refilled jars, and greeted tourists who praised the cafe without pausing long enough to understand the heart behind it. She listened to their words with gratitude, though she quietly wondered if anyone would ever look beyond the surface, if anyone would ever see the tired tenderness she hid so carefully. The sun dipped lower, stretching golden reflections across the floor. She closed the cafe for the afternoon break, sitting briefly near the window where sunlight warmed her skin. It was one of her rare moments of pause, when she allowed herself to breathe without thinking of lists, responsibilities, or what needed fixing. In the quiet, she felt both strong and fragile, worn yet luminous in a way only time can shape. She did not know her life was already shifting beneath the stillness. She did not know someone new was about to enter her world, someone whose presence would change the way she saw herself, someone who would make invisible corners of her heart glow again. For now, Helena simply sat with the weight of her years and the whisper of the sea, unaware that love, unexpected, improbable, and deeply real, was moving quietly toward her. Daniel arrived in the coastal town on a crisp morning, carrying the fatigue of years spent chasing recognition in kitchens where heat, ambition, and pressure collided. His life had been shaped by constant movement, new restaurants, new festivals, new reviews, yet something in him longed for a quieter rhythm. The invitation to cook at the local gastronomic festival felt like an escape disguised as an opportunity. When he stepped onto the sunlit street, he sensed a stillness he had not known in years. He wandered without direction, letting the wind guide him until he noticed a small cafe with its door partially open, as if welcoming anyone who carried tiredness in their bones. He entered out of curiosity, expecting nothing more than a simple cup of coffee. But the moment he crossed the threshold, his attention shifted toward a woman behind the counter. She moved with a serenity he found unusual. Her gestures were measured, almost poetic, as though she had learned to live in harmony with silence instead of resisting it. Daniel observed the way she arranged pastries, how she tucked hair behind her ear with an unconscious gentleness, how her eyes revealed a quiet endurance. She did not seem aware of him, nor did she attempt to be. Her presence felt like an anchor in a world that often demanded speed and performance. Something in him softened, not with attraction, but with recognition, a sense that she carried a depth he wanted to understand. He sat at a corner table and watched the cafe's morning routine unfold. Sunlight filtered through the window, catching on her profile and creating a halo of warm gold. Her maturity drew him in. There was no pretense, no effort to impress, no hunger for attention. She seemed to exist in a sphere of calm that contradicted the noise of his own life. It unsettled him in a strangely comforting way. Daniel had always admired strength, yet he had learned that the loudest people rarely possessed it. The quiet ones held it differently, with stability and dignity. Helena embodied that truth. He noticed tiny details that others ignored: the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her breath deepened when she felt overwhelmed, the faint sorrow in her eyes that appeared when she thought no one was looking. These subtleties told him stories long before words ever could. He returned the next morning, drawn by something he could not name. The cafe smelled of fresh bread and warm spices, and she moved through it like the keeper of a sacred routine. She acknowledged him with a polite nod, unaware of how intensely he studied the way she existed. Daniel felt an ease he rarely experienced, a sensation of grounding, of being in the presence of someone whose authenticity made the world feel gentler. He lingered longer than he intended, letting the quiet connect them in a way that did not require conversation. There was a purity in the silence, a space where he could breathe without performing, where he could observe without being observed. Her maturity attracted him not as a romantic impulse, but as something profoundly human, an energy that reminded him how fragile people become when they give too much of themselves for too long. He visited again in the afternoon, pretending it was coincidence. But internally, he understood it was not. He was drawn to the environment she built, to the emotional texture she carried, to the unspoken depth he sensed in her presence. She represented something he had been missing, a reminder that some people live with grace even after life has taken more than it has given. As he stepped out of the cafe that evening, he felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest. He could not name it yet, but it was the beginning of a connection that would challenge both of them, gently at first, then fiercely. Helena remained unaware of the shift she had just caused in him, but Daniel knew something had changed. He felt it in the quiet beating of his heart as the sea breeze moved around him, promising that nothing in his life would remain untouched. Helena noticed the subtle changes before she fully acknowledged them. Daniel's presence in the cafe had become familiar, not in an intrusive way, but in the quiet manner of someone who understood the rhythm of the place without disrupting it. He arrived at different hours, choosing corners where sunlight fell softly over the wooden tables, and observed the environment with a thoughtful calm that mirrored something she had long forgotten how to feel. She sensed his attentiveness not as pressure, but as a gentle shift in the air, the kind that makes someone lift their head without knowing why. Helena moved deliberately through her routine, grounding herself in tasks that had defined her days for years. Yet she found herself more aware of her surroundings, more conscious of the way her hands trembled slightly when she arranged pastries. more attentive to the warmth that rose to her cheeks when she realized Daniel was watching her with quiet interest. It felt unsettling, not because it lacked safety, but because it challenged the shell she had built around herself. She had spent so long protecting her vulnerability that the simple act of being seen felt both fragile and startling. Daniel, for his part, observed Helena with the same care he devoted to his craft. He noticed how her expression changed depending on the time of day, how mornings painted her with a determined light, how afternoons softened her presence with a kind of earned fatigue, and how the final hour before closing carried a stillness that hinted at stories she never told. He felt drawn to these hidden layers, to the maturity that shaped her posture, to the dignity in the way she carried both strength and exhaustion without asking anything from anyone. He started helping subtly, though Helena never requested it. A chair slightly out of place, a fallen napkin, an empty jar. He noticed these details instinctively and addressed them with the quiet efficiency of someone who respected boundaries. She resisted the small gestures at first, uncomfortable with the idea of accepting assistance from a customer. But his presence did not demand gratitude or connection. It simply existed, steady and unobtrusive, like a tide that rose without making noise. Their interactions were built on silence, on unspoken recognition, on the brief moments when their eyes met and lingered a second longer than usual. Helena tried to dismiss these sensations as coincidences, remnants of loneliness, misinterpreting kindness. She reminded herself that she was older, that experience had taught her to avoid illusions. Yet something in Daniel's demeanor contradicted every assumption she held. He carried attentiveness without expectation, warmth without pressure, and presence without intrusion. He returned daily, sometimes twice, sometimes more. Helena pretended not to notice his regularity, though her heart reacted before her thoughts could intervene. His youth should have created a barrier, yet it did not. Instead, it offered a contrast that she found strangely comforting. His energy was grounded, contemplative, and full of a patience that felt rare in men of any age. He watched her not with fascination, but with a quiet respect that stirred something long dormant inside her. On a particularly calm afternoon, Helena stepped outside to breathe in the salty air. Daniel happened to be leaving at the same moment, and for an instant they stood close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him. She sensed the way his presence settled into the space between them with a gentle force, as if acknowledging a truth neither had spoken. She looked away first, not out of discomfort, but out of the instinctive reflex of someone unaccustomed to being noticed so deeply. Inside, she tried to steady herself by focusing on simple tasks, sorting cups, refolding towels, adjusting the angle of a vase. Yet her pulse remained unsteady, betraying emotions she had not invited. She wondered how someone younger, free-spirited, and undoubtedly surrounded by opportunities could find interest in someone whose life had narrowed itself into predictable lanes. She questioned his intentions, though nothing about him suggested anything other than sincerity. Daniel left the cafe later that day with a quiet certainty forming inside him. The connection he sensed wasn't born from impulse or superficial attraction. It was rooted in the way Helena carried her experiences, in the way she embodied the type of maturity that comes from surviving life rather than running from it. He felt her strength even in her hesitations, her grace even in her tiredness, and her beauty in the way she avoided calling attention to herself. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Helena closed the cafe feeling something unfamiliar, a fragile anticipation, a soft shift within her chest, a recognition that someone had quietly stepped into a space she thought was permanently closed. She wasn't ready to name it, but the connection had already begun weaving itself through the invisible threads of her days. Lucas returned to town carrying the confidence of someone who believed he understood everything about his mother. He expected to find Helena exactly as he had left her, calm, reserved, predictable, functioning within the careful boundaries she had built over years. But the moment he stepped into the cafe, something felt different. He couldn't identify it immediately, yet an undercurrent of change lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. It unsettled him before he even understood why. He noticed Daniel almost instantly. The younger man stood near the counter, absorbed in the atmosphere with a quiet ease that looked intentional. Lucas observed the way Daniel's attention followed Helena, not boldly, but with a calm focus that suggested familiarity. A shift tightened in Lucas's chest as he watched his mother move around the cafe with a softness he hadn't witnessed in years. She carried the same silent strength as always, but there was something lighter about her movements, something he interpreted not as happiness, but as vulnerability exposed. Helena didn't see Lucas at first. She was arranging cups on the shelf, unaware that her son stood in the doorway, watching every detail with growing tension. Lucas's gaze sharpened when he noticed how Daniel tracked Helena's presence. It wasn't the observation of a customer. It was the attentiveness of someone emotionally invested. Lucas's protective instinct surged before his rational mind had time to intervene. He moved deeper into the room with slow steps, trying to understand the dynamic unfolding in front of him. Helena finally looked up, her expression shifting into brief surprise before she masked it with a composed smile. Lucas sensed the flicker he wasn't meant to see, the momentary unease, the quick inhale, the slight shift of her shoulders. It confirmed every suspicion he didn't want to have. He felt suddenly displaced, as though he had stepped into a version of his mother's life that no longer had room for him. Daniel noticed Lucas's presence and straightened subtly, his posture changing in a way that revealed awareness rather than discomfort. He understood immediately that the young man was connected to Helena, perhaps deeply. The way Lucas's gaze hardened left no doubt. The tension between the two men formed wordlessly, quiet but palpable, like a storm preparing itself without sound. Lucas watched the way Helena and Daniel existed in the same space, and something inside him snapped into fear. He had spent years believing he needed to protect his mother from disappointment, from heartache, from choices he assumed she couldn't navigate alone. Seeing a man younger than himself near her, calm, attentive, comfortable, felt like betrayal, not hers, but the world's, for shifting without his permission. He saw the difference in age not as possibility, but as danger. Helena sensed the heaviness settling over the room, though she could not trace its source. She felt Lucas's eyes on her, and recognized the silent judgment forming behind his expression. It pierced her with the same force as old criticisms she had once learned to endure. She felt exposed in ways she hadn't expected. The closeness she had allowed to grow around Daniel now felt like a fragile secret ripped open too early. Lucas could not articulate why the scene wounded him, but the effect was immediate. He felt pushed aside, replaced, rendered unnecessary. His mother had always been the anchor of his world, and he believed he was hers. Seeing her stand near another man, one younger, confident, and clearly drawn to her, ignited a protective anger tangled with insecurity. He interpreted concern as threat, connection as danger, maturity as weakness. Daniel remained steady, sensing the emotional storm building but refusing to retreat. His calmness only deepened Lucas's resentment. To Lucas, Daniel's composure reflected arrogance. To Helena, it reflected respect. That contrast widened an invisible divide between mother and son. Helena lowered her gaze, attempting to regain control of the atmosphere, but Lucas had already drawn his own conclusions. A shadow crossed his features as he realized something he had never considered. His mother had a life that did not revolve around him, feelings he did not control, and a desire to be more than the role she had played for so long. He wasn't prepared for that truth. As he turned to leave, he carried with him a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and fear, emotions that would ignite the conflict neither Helena nor Daniel anticipated. He didn't know that what he had seen would become the catalyst for a storm that would test all three of them. Helena felt the shift the moment the door closed behind him. The look her son had given her would linger in her mind long after Daniel left the cafe. Lucas returned the next morning with a determination shaped by confusion and fear. He had barely slept, replaying the scene inside the cafe until every detail carved itself deeper into his thoughts. He convinced himself that he had a duty to intervene, to protect his mother from something he did not yet understand but believed to be wrong. The age difference, the unfamiliar connection, the vulnerability he sensed in her posture, all of it felt like a threat to the order he had always known. He entered the cafe with an energy that clashed violently against the soft quiet of the morning. Helena stood behind the counter polishing cups, unaware of the storm approaching. For a moment, he watched her, noticing the faint glow around her features, the subtle warmth he hadn't seen there in years. Instead of softening him, the sight hardened his assumptions. He interpreted it as evidence of influence, of distraction, of deception he believed needed to be corrected. When he finally stepped forward, the intensity in his gaze drew attention from nearby customers. Helena looked up, startled by the sharp stiffness in his posture. Her heart tightened. She recognized the expression he wore, protective, impulsive, clouded by emotions he didn't know how to name. He had carried that look since childhood whenever he feared losing her to anything unfamiliar. She braced herself, sensing the fragile equilibrium of the cafe shifting into uncertainty. Lucas positioned himself in the center of the room, his presence demanding a confrontation Helena did not want. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in tense breath and a rigid jaw. In his mind, he was acting out of love, but the weight of his own insecurities fueled the misunderstanding he refused to acknowledge. He believed his mother had stepped into something dangerous, something inappropriate, something that threatened the stability he took for granted. Helena tried to steady her hands, realizing her son had become the center of attention. Customers observed the unfolding tension with silent curiosity. Their gazes made her skin burn with embarrassment. She felt a familiar ache rise within her, the ache of being misunderstood, judged, cornered by expectations that never considered her inner world. Lucas's silence grew louder than words, filling the cafe with a heaviness that made her breath shallow. Daniel entered just as the atmosphere tightened further. He stepped inside, unaware at first of the emotional storm before him. But when he saw Helena's posture, frozen, small, and tense, and noticed Lucas standing rigidly near the counter, he understood that something had unraveled in his absence. His instinct was to maintain calm, to avoid adding weight to an already fragile moment. Yet his presence alone intensified Lucas's discomfort. The energy shifted immediately. Lucas turned sharply toward Daniel, interpreting his arrival as confirmation of his worst fears. The sight of the younger man approaching the counter created a tension that rippled through the room. Customers exchanged glances, sensing the emotional fracture forming before them. The cafe, once a refuge, became a stage where Helena found herself exposed to scrutiny she had spent years avoiding. Lucas's heart pounded with a mixture of protectiveness and wounded pride. He believed his mother's dignity was at stake, and he felt compelled to defend her, even if she did not ask for it. He misread Daniel's steady expression as confidence born from carelessness. He saw the age difference as an imbalance, a dynamic he assumed could only end in heartbreak. His assumptions crystallized into judgment, spoken not through words, but through posture, tension, and the silent reproach in his eyes. Helena felt her world constrict. She sensed the walls closing in around her, the air thickening with shame. The judgment radiating from her son pierced through years of composure. She had lived her life with quiet responsibility, sacrificing dreams and desires in the name of stability. Yet now, standing under the weight of her son's misunderstanding, she felt stripped of the small fragments of joy she had cautiously allowed herself to feel. Daniel observed the situation with the maturity of someone who understood emotional wounds when he saw them. He recognized the fragile relationship between mother and son and the pain beneath Lucas's reaction. Rather than challenging him, Daniel remained still, offering calm where confrontation threatened to consume the room. But his restraint only deepened Lucas's resentment, feeding the belief that the younger man saw himself as superior, perhaps even entitled to be part of Helena's world. As the tension escalated, Helena felt her voice trapped beneath the pressure of embarrassment and fear of disappointing the one person she had always protected. The room seemed to close around her as whispers formed in the background, soft but piercing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and painfully aware that her son had placed her at the center of a scene she never intended to create. The judgment became a wound she couldn't easily ignore. The disappointment in Lucas's eyes cut deeper than any public humiliation. She felt herself shrinking, retreating internally in an attempt to shield her heart. The moment left her suspended in a painful awareness that no matter how much she gave, how much she sacrificed, her desires would always be questioned, her dignity fragile in the eyes of those she loved most. When Lucas finally walked away, Helena stood frozen by the counter, feeling the echoes of the scene reverberating inside her. The cafe slowly returned to its routine, but she remained anchored in a place of silent hurt. Daniel stayed near the doorway for a moment, sensing her pain, yet knowing she needed space to breathe through the wound inflicted by the one person she never expected to judge her so deeply. The morning after the confrontation unfolded with an ache that Helena felt in every quiet corner of the cafe. She arrived earlier than usual, as if the extra time might help her gather the scattered pieces of her composure. The room felt heavier, not because anything had changed physically, but because her sense of safety had been fractured. The memory of her son's judgment clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake, making her movements slower, more tentative. She wiped down the counter with a focused precision, hoping the familiar rhythm might steady her thoughts. Yet each motion carried a tremor she couldn't fully control. The humiliation she had felt the day before lingered, replaying in fragments that left her chest tight. She wasn't angry with Lucas, but the pain of being misunderstood settled deep within her, stirring doubts she believed she had put to rest long ago. She questioned her worth, the choices she made, and the small hopes she had allowed herself to nurture. Daniel entered quietly, sensing the fragility of the moment before Helena even looked up. He observed her posture, the lowered shoulders, the hesitation in her movements, the absence of the soft glow she carried naturally. Her vulnerability pressed against his heart with a weight he had not anticipated. He approached with caution, aware that anything he did might intensify the emotional tension she carried. Helena felt his presence and steadied herself before facing him. The sight of him brought a mixture of comfort and fear. Comfort, because his quiet strength had become familiar. Fear, because she knew any connection between them now felt dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of harm, but in the sense of consequences. She realized her son's reaction reflected a world she had always tried to navigate without drawing attention to herself. The age difference, the public scrutiny, the judgment, these were realities she couldn't ignore. She found herself retreating emotionally, creating distance not out of rejection, but out of self-preservation. She could not allow her private wounds to spill into decisions she wasn't ready to make. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Her silence wrapped around them with an intensity that spoke louder than any refusal. He understood that she was pulling away, not because of him, but because life had taught her to protect herself through withdrawal before allowing heartache to take root. He stepped back slightly, giving her room to breathe. The gesture revealed his maturity more than any spoken reassurance could have. Helena appreciated his restraint, yet the sight of his calm acceptance pierced her with guilt. She wanted to explain, to soften the distance forming between them, but she felt trapped beneath years of learned caution. She believed she needed to choose the safer path, the one that would cause the least disruption, even if it meant silencing something tender she had barely begun to understand. The cafe filled slowly with customers, but Helena's attention remained locked on her inner turmoil. She moved mechanically, avoiding any moment that might lead to connection. Daniel stayed seated by the window, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm, though he felt the shift widening between them. He interpreted it as a necessity, not as rejection. He respected the process, even as it stirred a quiet ache inside him. Helena continued her tasks with a dignity shaped by decades of resilience. She had learned to endure disappointment with grace, to carry burdens silently, to choose stillness over confrontation. Yet the hurt from the day before remained sharp. Her son's judgment made her question whether she had the right to experience something new, something unexpectedly meaningful. She convinced herself that stepping back was the mature choice, the responsible one, even if it cost her a piece of the light she had only just begun to rediscover. Daniel eventually stood to leave, sensing that staying longer would only deepen the emotional conflict she faced. He walked past her without forcing a moment of contact. His restraint felt heavy, yet necessary. Helena kept her eyes lowered, torn between gratitude for his understanding and sorrow for the distance she was creating. The silence between them held all the words they were not ready to speak. When the day ended, Helena closed the cafe slowly, lingering at the window where the evening light spilled across the floor in warm tones. She fought the urge to cry, not out of heartbreak, but out of exhaustion. She had carried too many years of expectations, too many sacrifices, too many roles that allowed little space for her own desires. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself a single quiet moment to acknowledge the truth she feared. She had felt something real, something gentle, something she wasn't sure life would allow her to keep. Daniel walked along the shoreline outside, sensing the ache of separation settling into his chest. He didn't regret the connection he had allowed himself to feel, but he recognized that some emotional paths require patience rather than pursuit. He respected her silence, her boundaries, and the weight of the past she carried. The distance, though painful, was an act of care from both sides, a dignified pause in a connection that neither fully understood yet. Helena locked the door behind her, carrying her quiet ache into the night. She believed she had protected her son, preserved stability, and chosen responsibility. Yet beneath the layers of caution, a small part of her mourned the possibility she had pushed away. She didn't realize that this separation, though painful, was only the beginning of a deeper truth waiting to unfold. Daniel spent the following days moving through the town with a heaviness that clung to him more tightly than he wished to admit. He continued attending rehearsals for the gastronomic festival, tasting new ingredients, planning presentations, and responding to the expectations of others with his usual composure. Yet his mind wandered constantly to the quiet cafe by the sea. Every detail he remembered about Helena threaded itself through his thoughts with a persistence that surprised him. Her careful movements, her soft strength, her guarded heart. Each memory felt like a call pulling him toward a deeper understanding of what he had begun to feel. He recognized that the shift inside him had not started during the confrontation with Lucas. It had begun earlier, in the gentle silence of mornings when Helena arranged cups with meticulous grace, and in afternoons when her presence allowed him a type of peace he had not felt in years. He had admired her long before conflict entered the picture, but the moment he saw her shrink beneath her son's judgment, something inside him sharpened into clarity. He realized he cared for her beyond curiosity or admiration. He cared with a sincerity that demanded a type of responsibility he did not take lightly. He walked along the shoreline each morning, studying the patterns of the waves as though they could help him understand the complexity of Helena's emotions. He knew she carried a lifetime of quiet endurance. He sensed the layers of her past: heartache, duty, sacrifice, and the silent ache of being overlooked. He also recognized that her son's judgment had reopened old wounds she had spent years concealing behind calm gestures and practiced smiles. The pain he had seen in her eyes haunted him more deeply than he expected. He considered the age difference with a seriousness most people seldom applied. To him, it was neither a novelty nor a challenge. It was simply a truth, one shaped by time rather than by incompatibility. Helena's maturity drew him with a force that felt grounded, not impulsive. She held wisdom in her silence, resilience in her posture, and a beauty shaped by everything she had survived. He felt humbled by it. Her age did not diminish her. It revealed her. It gave depth to her presence, gravity to her gestures, and meaning to the connection growing between them. He realized he wanted to protect her, not from the world, but from the weight of doubt she had been taught to carry. He wanted to be someone who understood her without demanding pieces of her she was not ready to give. He wanted to be someone she could lean on without fear of losing herself. He questioned his ability to offer that kind of stability. Yet everything inside him insisted that the connection he felt was more than a fleeting sentiment. It was rooted in respect, admiration, and the soft certainty that her presence had awakened something dormant in him. He visited the cafe again, though not with expectations. He approached it the way one approaches a fragile truth, with humility. He noticed Helena inside, moving with her usual precision, though her steps seemed slightly heavier. She looked smaller somehow, as if carrying an invisible weight that pressed down on her shoulders. He watched her from outside the window for a moment, allowing himself the quiet freedom to acknowledge how deeply he felt for her. He didn't enter that day. He sensed she needed space, needed to rebuild whatever had fractured inside her. He returned the next morning, simply to walk past the cafe and observe from a respectful distance. He felt a responsibility to understand her pain before approaching her again. He allowed himself to reflect on the nature of connection, how fragile it could be, how influenced it was by fear, how easily it could be silenced by judgment. He understood that Helena had spent a lifetime protecting her dignity, and that the scene with her son had placed her in a position she avoided at all costs. Vulnerability exposed in public. He recognized that her withdrawal was not rejection. It was instinct. She was someone who had learned to survive disappointment quietly, someone who had learned to fold her desires into small corners of her heart, because life had rarely allowed her the freedom to express them. Her silence, her distance, her caution, they were shields shaped by experience. Daniel saw them clearly, and instead of being discouraged, he felt an even deeper respect for her strength. He realized that if he wanted to be part of her life in any meaningful way, he would need to offer patience rather than insistence, presence rather than pressure, understanding rather than pursuit. He needed to show her, through actions, not intensity, that she was worth choosing. He resolved to approach her not as someone seeking romance, but as someone seeking truth. He wanted her to know that her age, her scars, her hesitations were not obstacles. They were the very reasons she moved him so deeply. That afternoon, he walked along the edge of the sea and allowed the realization to settle fully inside him. He was falling for her, not with urgency, not with impulsive passion, but with a depth that felt steady, intentional, and rooted in admiration. It startled him, yet it grounded him. He did not know what would come next, but he understood that whatever path unfolded, he would walk it with respect for the woman whose quiet resilience had awakened a part of him he thought he had lost. The festival approached with increasing pressure, bringing a flurry of deliveries, decorations, and last-minute preparations that filled the town with a restless energy. Merchants hung banners, musicians rehearsed on street corners, and visitors arrived in waves that gave the air a sense of anticipation. Helena observed the commotion from inside her cafe, feeling oddly distant from the excitement. She continued working with her usual dedication, yet the spark she once felt in her routines had dimmed beneath the emotional weight she carried. The confrontation with her son had fractured her sense of stability. She replayed the moment over and over, analyzing her own posture, her silence, her inability to shield herself from judgment. She wondered whether she had allowed herself to hope for something she should have ignored. The connection with Daniel had been tender, unexpected, and frightening in its quiet intensity. Now it felt like a fragile secret that life had punished her for daring to feel. Late one afternoon, as the festival's opening ceremony drew near, a sudden commotion erupted outside. A cart loaded with equipment tipped over near the cafe entrance, sending boxes crashing against the pavement. The noise startled Helena, and when she stepped outside, she discovered that several crates of supplies, belonging to the festival team, had toppled into the walkway, blocking access to her shop and scattering fragile items across the ground. Workers rushed to gather the fallen pieces, but their frustration quickly turned toward Helena's cafe, as if the accident had been her fault for occupying the corner. A few murmurs rose among the crowd, subtle but sharp enough to reach her ears. She felt heat rush to her cheeks, an echo of the humiliation she had recently endured. The workers argued among themselves, blaming poor planning, blaming each other, and indirectly blaming her for being in the way. She stood frozen, unable to defend herself without drawing attention she didn't want. Daniel arrived just as a group of volunteers began discussing whether the cafe should close temporarily to avoid obstruction. Their words cut into Helena, reopening wounds she hadn't allowed to heal. She felt her breath tighten, her posture shrinking beneath the pressure. The situation mirrored her deepest fears: public scrutiny, misplaced blame, and the feeling of being small in a world that rarely offered her grace. Daniel assessed the scene instantly. He saw Helena standing near the doorway, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the chaos with a mixture of confusion and shame. He recognized the emotional vulnerability she tried to hide. Without hesitation, he stepped into the situation with a calm authority that made people pause. He moved with composed confidence, not dominance, addressing the fallen equipment and guiding volunteers to reorganize the space efficiently. He lifted heavy crates, reorganized scattered supplies, and redirected frustrated workers without raising his voice. His presence brought order to the chaos, not by force, but by example. He returned the space to functionality with a precision that impressed onlookers and softened the tension. He acted not to prove anything, but because he understood instinctively that Helena needed support in this moment, not protection, but partnership. As he worked, he positioned himself in a way that subtly shielded Helena from the murmurs and glances. His actions communicated what words never could. She was not alone, not burdensome, not invisible. She watched in silence, overwhelmed by the quiet strength he brought to a situation that had left her shaken. She realized he wasn't acting out of impulse or heroism. He was acting out of genuine care. When the last crate was repositioned and the walkway cleared, the volunteers expressed gratitude, their earlier irritation replaced by appreciation. The tension dissipated. People returned to their tasks. The moment of scrutiny melted into the background noise of festival preparation. Helena stood by the doorway, her breath steadying as she absorbed the impact of what had just happened. Daniel didn't linger. He stepped back with the same calmness he had arrived, giving her space to process the emotional shift. Helena felt something stir inside her. Not guilt, not fear, but a quiet recognition. His actions reflected understanding, not pity, respect, not intrusion. He had stepped in precisely where she felt weakest, without making her feel small. It was a gesture that demanded nothing in return, yet changed everything inside her. The moral clarity of his actions settled deeply within her. She realized that the distance she had created was based on fear, not truth. The world may have judged her. Her son may have misunderstood her. But the man standing before her had seen her with a depth she had not expected from anyone, much less someone younger. As Daniel walked away to return to festival preparations, Helena watched him with a softened gaze, sensing the beginnings of a shift she could no longer ignore. The proof she had needed, not to trust him but to trust herself, had quietly unfolded before her. Lucas spent the next days carrying a restlessness he could not hide. The scene in the cafe replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity, yet something within him began to shift as the initial surge of anger faded. He walked through the town trying to make sense of his reaction, replaying the way Helena had stood behind the counter, small, shaken, yet composed despite the weight he had placed on her. It was the memory of her eyes that lingered most, the softness in them shadowed by hurt he had never meant to cause. He observed the festival preparations spreading through the streets, but even the lively atmosphere could not distract him. He saw families moving together, friends laughing, strangers helping one another with decorations. These simple displays of connection created a contrast that drew him inward, forcing him to reflect on the space he had taken in his mother's life. He had always believed he was protecting her, but he began to wonder if he had been protecting himself instead. Protecting the version of her he was comfortable with, the version that needed him. When he passed near the cafe, he hesitated, unsure whether he should enter. The memory of his outburst in that room returned with uncomfortable force. He noticed the familiar tables through the window, the soft lighting, the quiet rhythm Helena maintained even when the world around her shifted. She moved with a calm he had always admired, yet he had overlooked how much effort it cost her to maintain it. He observed her from afar, noticing the subtle heaviness in her movements, the lingering sadness in her posture. It struck him with sudden clarity that he had added to her burden rather than easing it. He turned away before she could see him, but the guilt settled heavily in his chest. He walked farther down the street, trying to justify his reaction, searching for reasons that no longer felt valid. Each argument he attempted to reconstruct dissolved beneath the growing awareness that he had misinterpreted what he saw. The man he had judged, the younger chef who seemed so out of place in his mother's world, had not shown arrogance or inappropriate confidence. Instead, he had shown restraint, respect, and a calm that contrasted sharply with Lucas's impulsive frustration. Later that afternoon, he overheard two festival volunteers discussing the incident with the fallen crates. They described how Daniel had stepped in to help, how efficiently he had resolved the chaos, and how gently he had guided the frustrated workers without placing blame. Lucas listened quietly, unable to ignore the way their words contradicted the assumptions he had made. He pictured his mother standing outside her cafe, overwhelmed by the commotion, and realized that Daniel had been there when Lucas had not. The realization stung, not out of jealousy, but out of recognition that someone else had seen her suffering before he did. He wandered toward the shoreline, letting the waves absorb his tension. He watched the water move with an ease he envied, its repetition grounding him in a way that words could not. His thoughts drifted back to childhood moments, his mother brushing hair from his forehead, comforting him after disappointments, working tirelessly to build a life that allowed him opportunities she never had. He remembered her sacrifices, her resilience, her quiet grace. These memories softened him, replacing defensiveness with understanding. He realized that the idea of seeing his mother with someone younger had triggered fears he had never acknowledged. It had forced him to confront the reality that she had needs, desires, and an inner life separate from the role she played as his mother. The discomfort came not from judgment, but from unfamiliarity. He had never considered the possibility that she could fall in love again, that she deserved companionship, affection, or joy that went beyond family duties. As the sun began to fall behind the horizon, coloring the sky with warm hues, Lucas felt a shift within himself. He understood that his mother's age did not make her unworthy of love, nor did Daniel's youth disqualify him from offering sincerity. The connection he had witnessed between them had not been inappropriate. It had been gentle, hesitant, and filled with respect. It had been something he might have recognized sooner if he had not been so focused on protecting an outdated image of her. He returned home with a quieter heart, carrying the weight of regret, but also the beginning of acceptance. He knew he needed to speak with Helena eventually, though not in a rushed or defensive way. He wanted to understand, not accuse. He wanted to listen, not judge. He wanted to be the son she deserved, one capable of seeing her as a woman with dreams and emotions, not just as the guardian of his childhood. As he prepared for sleep that night, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in days, a small but steady sense of clarity. His perception had begun to shift, not out of obligation, but out of genuine understanding. And though he didn't know what the future held for Helena or Daniel, he sensed that the story unfolding between them was rooted in truth, not illusion. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps his mother was not stepping into danger, but into a chance for tenderness she had long been denied. The cafe was quiet the following evening, its warm lights casting soft reflections across the polished tables. The festival activity buzzed outside with vibrant music and colorful lanterns, but inside, everything felt still. Helena moved through the space with measured grace, her movements steady yet tinged with a vulnerability she had not fully shaken. The emotional distance she had created remained intact, yet it no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a barrier she wasn't certain she wanted to keep. She cleaned a table near the window, pausing when she saw Daniel standing outside. He didn't approach immediately. He remained beneath the glow of a lantern, watching her with an expression tempered by patience. She felt her heart tighten with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She had spent days convincing herself to maintain distance, but the quiet certainty in his gaze softened her resolve. Daniel stepped inside after a few quiet breaths, moving delicately through the space as though respecting the fragility of the moment. His presence carried a quiet warmth, filling the room without overwhelming it. Helena sensed something different in him, not urgency, not expectation, but a depth shaped by reflection. He approached with the respectful distance of someone who understood that emotions, once bruised, required care rather than pressure. Helena's hands trembled slightly as she placed a cloth on the counter. She felt exposed in a way she rarely allowed. It wasn't the exposure of shame or fear. It was the exposure of being seen too deeply, too clearly. Yet she didn't look away. She allowed herself to meet his gaze, to acknowledge the sincerity that had been present since the beginning. The silence between them carried the weight of everything unspoken. Helena felt the accumulation of days spent suppressing her emotions, the longing, the fear, the confusion, the desire to protect her son, and the ache of pushing away something that had felt unexpectedly real. Her breath deepened as she recognized the truth she had been avoiding. She had felt something genuine with Daniel, something she had never expected to feel again at her age. She sensed Daniel was offering her space to speak without words, to reveal her heart through presence rather than explanations. He stepped closer, slowly enough that she could retreat if she wished. She did not. Instead, she felt an unusual calm settling into her chest, as though the world outside had fallen into silence just long enough for her to understand herself more clearly. Her eyes softened as she allowed her emotions to surface. Emotions shaped not by romance, but by truth. She felt gratitude for his patience, admiration for his maturity, and a fragile hope she had been too afraid to acknowledge. She knew she could not express everything aloud, but she let her expression carry what her voice could not. She offered him an openness she had withheld for years, a gesture of trust shaped by honesty rather than certainty. Daniel sensed her shift, the unspoken invitation for understanding. He did not reach for her, or attempt to draw her into anything she wasn't ready for. He simply remained close, letting the space between them fill with the sincerity he had carried since their first encounter. His presence was quiet, yet grounding, a silent reassurance that she did not need to protect herself from him. Helena felt a warmth in her chest, a soft lightness she had forgotten she could feel. She allowed her guard to lower gently, not through words, but through the delicate acceptance of what stood before her. She let him see her, not the composed woman she presented to the world, but the one who carried years of quiet sorrow, resilience, and unexpressed longing. In that stillness, something in her heart loosened, freeing a truth she had buried beneath responsibility. She recognized that her fear had not been about Daniel, nor about the age difference. It had been about herself, about feeling worthy of affection, about allowing herself to experience something tender after years of silence. The realization moved through her like a gentle tide, lifting the weight she had carried since Lucas's confrontation. Daniel felt her confession in the way she breathed, in the ease returning to her posture, in the gentle clarity of her gaze. Without a single word exchanged, they understood each other. It was not a declaration of love, nor a promise of a future. It was something quieter, something deeper, a recognition that the connection between them was real, rooted in truth, and deserving of space to grow. As the lanterns outside flickered with the evening breeze, Helena allowed herself to stand beside him without fear. The confession had been silent, but unmistakable. It was the moment when two lives, shaped by different paths, different ages, different scars, met in the stillness of a truth neither could deny. The festival reached its peak on a warm evening filled with lights, music, and the kind of communal excitement that made the entire town feel alive. Lanterns swung gently in the breeze, casting golden reflections across the promenade. Families wandered through the decorated streets, children chased each other near the food stalls, and the sound of laughter drifted into the open air like a soft current. Helena stepped outside her cafe, absorbing the atmosphere with a quiet heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt something subtle ease within her, an inner shift shaped not by certainty, but by acceptance. She walked along the cobblestone path, the glow of lanterns illuminating her features with a softness that revealed the woman she had been hiding for years. Her steps were slower, more deliberate, guided by a quiet strength she had begun reclaiming. The echoes of the confrontation with Lucas had not vanished, but they no longer held the weight they once did. Instead, they lived alongside a growing sense of clarity. She understood now that the world judged what it did not understand, and that her own worth was not defined by anyone's discomfort, not even her son's. Daniel stood at the center of the festival grounds, overseeing the final preparations for his culinary presentation. He moved with a calm command, guiding volunteers with quiet gestures and steady confidence. When he lifted his eyes and saw Helena approaching from a distance, his expression softened in a way that revealed everything he had been holding inside. He did not move toward her immediately. He simply took in the sight of her, poised, luminous, and carrying her years with a grace that humbled him. People around him noticed the shift in his posture. They followed his gaze and recognized Helena, the woman from the small cafe who had become a subtle presence in the community. Some whispered softly, recalling recent events or piecing together their own assumptions. But the tone of the murmurs had changed. The incident with the fallen crates had circulated through town more quickly than Helena realized, and many had witnessed Daniel's steady support during the chaos. Respect for him had grown, and by extension, so had curiosity, and perhaps admiration toward her. Lucas arrived moments later, weaving through the crowd with an uncertain expression. He had spent the past days wrestling with the truth he had slowly come to accept. When he spotted his mother near the festival lights, he paused, letting the sight of her settle into his chest. She stood alone, yet not lonely. She radiated a serenity he had never seen so clearly. It struck him with a mix of humility and regret. He realized how little he had understood about the woman who had devoted her life to him. Helena noticed him approaching. The brief tension tightening her breath softened when she saw something new in his eyes. Not judgment, not confusion, but quiet understanding. He hesitated before stepping closer, and she sensed the weight of emotions he carried. She felt no anger toward him, only a fragile tenderness shaped by years of love that had survived many fragile seasons. Lucas stopped beside her, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. It was not an apology, yet it carried the essence of one. Daniel watched from afar, sensing the moment unfolding between mother and son. He did not intervene. He understood the importance of allowing them the space to mend what had fractured. Lucas glanced toward the chef in the distance, and in that single gesture, something inside him loosened. He saw not a rival, not a threat, but a man whose presence gently complemented the woman who had raised him. Acceptance did not bloom instantly, but the soil had finally softened enough to allow it. As the presentation began, people gathered around the long tables where Daniel's dishes were arranged with elegant simplicity. Helena and Lucas stood slightly apart from the crowd, observing the scene. When Daniel stepped forward to begin his demonstration, the lights reflected against his features with a quiet warmth. His hands moved with purpose, his posture steady, his focus unwavering. Every gesture conveyed the same maturity Helena had witnessed from the beginning. During the presentation, a brief mishap occurred when a tray nearly tipped from a volunteer's hands. Without hesitation, Daniel reached out to steady it, offering the young helper a reassuring nod. The crowd murmured approvingly, touched by the effortless grace with which he handled the moment. Helena felt a subtle swell of pride, recognizing the same calm strength he had shown during the chaos outside her cafe. The strength that had spoken to her more deeply than any romantic gesture ever could. As the demonstration concluded, applause filled the square. People approached Daniel to praise his work, and in the shifting lights, their admiration extended toward Helena as well. Some offered kind smiles, others subtle nods of respect. The tone was different, less curious, more accepting. Not because they fully understood the connection between them, but because they sensed its sincerity. Daniel finally approached Helena, moving through the crowd with a quiet certainty. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough for their presence to meet, yet far enough to allow her the freedom to choose her next step. Helen lifted her eyes to him, feeling a calm wash over her. She sensed Lucas beside her, not resisting, but observing with a gentler gaze. The air between them felt warm, unhurried, and filled with a truth that did not require words. Helena offered a small, sincere smile, one shaped by acceptance, courage, and a growing belief that she was worthy of being seen. Daniel returned her expression with the same steady affection that had defined every moment between them. Lucas watched the exchange, recognizing the authenticity of what he saw. He did not step away. He did not interrupt. Instead, he stood quietly beside his mother, allowing her to exist fully in a moment she had earned with a lifetime of silent resilience. The festival lights glowed above them, reflecting across Helena's features with a gentle brightness. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her age, her sacrifices, or her routine, but for the woman she truly was, a woman with depth, with dignity, with desires she no longer needed to hide. The Recommeso was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, visible, and shared by all who stood near enough to witness. Helena stepped forward, not into uncertainty, but into possibility, into a future shaped not by judgment, but by truth, into a love that honored her strength, her years, and the luminous softness she had learned to reclaim.